Today is the 22nd of January 2019, and this is a conversation between Emilio Longo and Peter Bougie. Peter, I warmly welcome you to Skill-Based Art, a learning resource for art students and artist teachers. I've been looking forward to our conversation for quite some time now.
Thank you, Emilio. I have been looking forward to it as well.
Fantastic. So let's get a start. Now, Peter, I understand you presently live and paint from your home in western Wisconsin in the United States. Did you grow up there?
No, I did not grow up in River Falls, Wisconsin. I grew up in various places around Wisconsin and later on also in Minnesota, a neighboring state.
Fantastic. Lovely. And you've pretty much been there for your whole life?
That's correct. I've lived in the Midwest, Minnesota or Wisconsin my entire life.
Great. So moving into your childhood, what place did art occupy during your childhood years?
Well, I always liked to draw. My dad had some drawing talent, and he taught me some fundamentals. The subjects of my drawings when I was a boy were they consisted entirely of army men, as I called soldiers, and football players.
I see.
I was also fascinated, though, by art reproductions. We had a 3-volume set of books at our family home, called the Catholic Book of Knowledge.
Okay.
And it was liberally illustrated with reproductions of religious paintings from the European tradition, old masterworks.
Lovely. I see.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on to my next question. Are you able to recall how you were introduced to the realist tradition?
Well, I think my first exposure would have been through these books that I just mentioned.
Sure.
Throughout my school years, for like middle school and high school, there were art classes, but the teachers of these classes generally discouraged my persistent interest in realist art. I had one teacher in the 7th or 8th grade who did not. God bless him, he actually encouraged me to draw some still life arrangements and to try my hand at drawing landscapes.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So in this this collection of images you had in the book that you mentioned, who were some of the artists that you were exposed to?
Well, it would have been anybody you can think of from Renaissance time, from Giotto, Michelangelo, Raphael, through Caravaggio, Rembrandt, Titian, Van Eyck, any European artist you can think of, really, who had done religiously themed paintings up through I believe some pre-Raphaelites, like I can't remember which ones were in the book exactly.
Sure.
But his name escapes me at the moment. But he did a whole series of black and white, I believe they were pen and ink drawings of gospel illustrations.
I see.
I can't think of his name at the moment. But anyway, yeah. There were artists from Renaissance times up through the 19th century represented in that book.
Lovely, lovely, fantastic. And just to clarify, Peter, so you did study art during your high school years, that's correct?
Well, very minimally. As I said, the classes were, there would be a class a semester. So maybe I would have one semester a year of art, an hour a day, or maybe 3 hours a week. And honestly, the art classes during my school years were generally considered to be kind of a screw-off class.
I see.
So they weren't very serious at all.
Yes, I understand. Okay, moving on. Can you provide a detailed overview of your struggle in finding a teacher that would help you to reconnect with the grand painting traditions of the past?
Well, I was really interested in doing realist painting, but I didn't know a lot about the tradition.
Sure.
And I subscribed to American Artist magazine,
mm-hmm.
and in the early '80s there was an article about the painter Richard Whitney.
Sure.
In American Artist, Whitney was a student of Gamel's.
Yep.
And he mentioned Lack's Atelier in his article, that it was located in Minneapolis.
Sure.
And I lived only a couple of hours away from Minneapolis at the time, and so within a fairly short time, I guess within a year, I was taking night classes at the Atelier. And then within about a year and a half, I was a full-time student there.
Fantastic.
So the struggle for me at that time was making the decision to leave my working life and go back to school. I was 27
Wow.
before I began studies with Lack, and he warned me it was kind of late, but obviously I decided to go.
So you mentioned you had a working life before you started your training with Mr. Lack. What were you doing?
I worked in construction work. I was in fact, am still a carpenter.
I see. Wow. Okay, that seems like quite a sacrifice to have left the security of a full-time job to pursue a painting career.
Well, yeah, sort of. You look back sometimes and you wonder what would have happened if this or that. But uh, yeah, it was that. I guess that was part of the big struggle I just referenced. Was should I leave this to go to school? And then, I guess eventually that's what I did decide to do. So
Sure. Okay. Moving on. I'm aware that Brian Lewis, who was your friend and former instructor at the Bougie Studio, which is a school in which you founded, studied art at the University of Minnesota in the 1970s before finding Richard Lack. He referred to his training with Mr. Lack as, quote, the best educational experience of my life, unquote. Did you have any experience studying art in a university at any point?
no, I never studied at a university at all.
Okay, great. So your training was directly to Mr. Lack, nothing before that, prior to high school.
That's correct.
I see. Okay. I would like to acknowledge that today Mr. Lewis teaches at the Atelier Studio program of fine art in Minneapolis. Moving on. Many artists who came to find Mr. Lack shared a common experience of training with various teachers that had conflicting views on the Western tradition of European painting. Can you explain this series of events that led you to your discovery of Mr. Lack? You've touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. It isn't a long. I did not have a long struggle of going from one school to another or working with various different teachers like some folks did. That's the series of events is subscribing to American Artist magazine and later seeing the article I just mentioned, and then of course signing up for art classes. And my progress in those persuaded Mr. Lack that I might be suitable for full-time study.
Fantastic, great. Yeah, it sounds like you had a pretty easy search then, not too much trouble.
That's correct. I did not have a difficult search to find Mr. Lack.
Great, fantastic. Now, you came to train with Mr. Lack at Atelier Lack in Minneapolis for 4 years, between 1983 to 1987. Do you recall the first time you walked into Atelier Lack?
Yes, I do. I remember I made an appointment to see Mr. Lack after I had saw the article in American Artist magazine,
Okay,
and I brought some work, and it was on a Saturday, I believe. And I showed it to Lack and to Steve Jertson,
sure.
and they encouraged me to take some night classes, which I did, as I said. I took one
Okay.
of Steve's life drawing classes and one of George Herman's still life drawing classes.
Mm-hmm.
And it really began to open my eyes as to what it meant to see in the sense that an artist must see to draw.
Sure.
Uh, I remember my interview for the full time position more clearly. I hauled a ton of artwork, very little of which was not later destroyed, up up the stairs to the old atelier on South Hennepin in uptown Minneapolis.
Sure.
Afterwards, afterwards, I felt like I had given it my best shot. And if Lack would have called and said, thanks, but we don't have a place for you, I think I would have moved on and not looked back. But ultimately, he accepted my application and I went.
Fantastic. So, Peter, just to clarify, what was your skill like prior to enrolling at Atelier Lac? Was your drawing quite developed by that point?
I had, it was kind of lopsided. I had done a lot of painting, but I didn't really know what I was doing.
Sure.
And I had some facility for seeing shapes
Mm-hmm.
and drawing outlines, but I did not understand value at all.
I see.
So I really did not understand how to draw in mass tones until I began studying at the atelier. And so then I started to learn about it in the night classes that I just referenced.
Okay, sure. Now, who were some of the artists that were training at Atelier Lac during your time?
Well, there are a couple who started at the same time that I did, Louise Levine and Tim Deers,
Mm-hmm.
Timothy Deers.
Mm-hmm.
Also, uh, some others who were there and more advanced at the time were Jeff Larson,
Mm-hmm.
Dave Erickson, Mike Coyle,
Mm-hmm.
Kathleen Lowry, Deb Askey,
Mm-hmm.
Gene Grapp, Reed Knutson, Dean Calamus, Carl Sampson. Of course, Brian Lewis was there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, later on, after some who came after I had started in later years were Bob Bonowitz, Dan Hoekstra, Dave Doss, Bruno Certo, Chris Sismasia, Peggy Rathman, Marcia Haggerty, to name some. I'm sure I'm missing some folks, but yeah, those are the ones I can recall at the moment.
Fantastic. That's quite a few there. Great. Now, can you recall the first time you met Mr. Lack?
Yes, it was at that appointment I mentioned earlier when he recommended that I take night classes. He was very polite and respectful, very soft spoken and articulate, but at the same time firm in his convictions. I was very impressed with him. I felt like he was very sincere, and that I was in good hands with him.
Sure. And I'm presuming that was the first time you had met a professional full-time painter?
I'm not sure about that, but certainly was the first time I had met anyone as accomplished as Richard Lack.
Sure. Okay, great. Are you able to provide information on some of the highlights from your training with Mr. Lack?
Well, you know, Lack advertised that his teaching was hands on, and that was the truth. So I'll tell you of one incident. I was working on one of my first head studies. I think it was late in my second year of study,
Mm-hmm.
and I was really struggling with it. And
Sure.
he came in one day to critique and told me I was making my darks too dark, the shadow tones on the side of the face and so on.
Okay.
And so I couldn't see it. And so he pointed to shadows in the hair and then to shadows on the side of the face and to dark accents like the nostril and the pupil and asked me to compare them to each other. And he asked me if I saw what he was talking about. And I really did not. I was very frustrated and very stuck in the work. So he took my palette and my brushes and mixed up a couple of tones, a couple of notes, and brushed them onto the painting. They were lighter and warmer than what I had down, yet they still had sufficient contrast with the light areas to read as shadow.
Mm-hmm.
I was amazed at how lifelike the notes he made looked, and
Sure.
at that was a moment that I look back to as a moment when I began to see differently. Although it still took me a long time to incorporate that simple lesson about value relationships, tone relationships into everything I did. Now
Okay.
he worked a long time also on me to get me to see warmth in color.
Sure.
He was always critiquing me for cold color, and he found creative ways to communicate this. Well, one day, after having critiqued me many times for this same issue, he walked in and looked at my painting and stood there still for a moment, and then made a shuddering gesture and said, "Burr." So I got the message.
What a lovely story. Now, Mr. Lack developed many terminologies to explain certain drawing and painting principles and methods. Some are obvious, however, others can be tricky to the layman. What exactly does the smash of light mean?
Well, a smash of light, as I understand it, refers to establishing a strong light effect at the focal point of your composition.
I see.
Uh, in part, it also of course refers to an effect of nature, which is the most intense part of the lit area of whatever you are painting. So, using the word smash is just a way of emphasizing how strong the effect should be.
I see.
The word smash and light are kind of incongruous. They're an unlikely combination of words,
I
and so
see.
it gets your attention. You wonder, well, what does that mean? Well, smash communicates the idea of impact, and strong light effects in nature have a powerful impact.
I
So,
see.
smash of light was a phrase that I think was designed to crack the complacency of sort of an ordinary workaday outlook.
I
And
see.
for some reason, I think that phrase might have come from Gamble, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So in other words, this phrase is referring to the greatest area of contrast in a painting. Is that right?
Yeah, the most kind of like that, but the most intense part of the light, the thing that really has the most impact.
So the lightest light.
That's yeah, yeah.
Okay. What other terminologies can you recall from your training with Mr. Lack?
Um, Make it like is a thing that he said a lot, as in make it like what you see.
Sure.
He talked a lot about freshening your eye, as in walking away from the work now and then,
Mm-hmm.
or as in using a mirror to view it backwards, and so thus upset your complacency, visual sort of complacency.
I
He
see.
talked all, he talked all the time about color value, or tone, as you would call it, a term describing a habit of seeing color and value as one thing,
Sure.
or as or as perceiving how color was entirely dependent on light,
I
and
see.
of divorcing you from the natural inclination to see color as local. For instance, anyone can look at a red shirt and see that it's red. That's what you call local color,
Sure.
the red shirt or the white shirt or whatever. So it's the color of the object. But as an artist, you must learn to see the color value of the color values, I should say plural, that are in a local color. So the
Absolutely.
red shirt, the red shirt has lights and darks and various tones in between. If you want to represent the visual truth of it, you need to understand these things. And color value was a term that he used in reference to that. He also
Fantastic.
used various musical terms like key to
Sure.
refer to the degree of value, and note, which referred to hitting the precise quality of any given color.
I see.
Um, he used the term arabesque frequently to refer to an intricacy of line in both the compositional sense and as intricacies of shape found in nature and manifested as lines in terms of contrasting value shapes in the two dimensions of a painting. And
Fantastic.
he talked about keeping your eye moving around and looking at the whole motif, especially if you were concentrating on a particular passage. He would constantly admonish you to keep your eye moving around the whole thing, comparing the area you were working on to everything else, so that you didn't zero in on something and create a whole new sort of range of values in that area without relating them to the entire work. And related to that, he'd like to remind you to always make your value tone judgments in relation to the focal point of the painting.
Fantastic. Lovely. What great advice. So just to clarify something, Peter, you mentioned that Mr. Lack would always speak about keeping your eye fresh. Now, there's a phrase that I've heard, and I'm not sure if it comes from Gamel or from Lack. It goes by the terms of a fresh guy with a fresh eye. Did you recall him mentioning that at any point?
Would you say that again, please?
A fresh guy with a fresh eye?
Fresh guy with a fresh eye?
Yes.
I haven't heard that before, but that's like, yeah, you freshen your attitude and your mental outlook, as well as your ability to see something.
Sure. Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Now, you graduated from Atelier Lac in 1987. What were some of the projects you worked on during your final year there?
Well, during that year, I did an interior with a life-size three-quarter figure seated. I
Sure.
was very, I was very invested in it at the time, but I haven't looked at it in many years now. But
Okay.
I also began to do a lot of landscape sketching at that time.
Absolutely. Sure. Okay. Now, whilst you were a student at Atelier Lac, you taught composition and anatomy for part of your time there, between 1986 to 1988. How did you come to gain this teaching position?
Well, I don't clearly recall how. I probably lobbied him for it, and he consented.
Sure.
Um, I enjoyed anatomy, and I had a knack for it, and and composition was something that I wanted to understand better, and so having to teach it would give me an idea to delve into it a little bit more. But yeah, I probably lobbied him for it, and he said, "Well, sure, let's give it a try."
Sure. Okay, great. Did you have to develop the curriculum or was it provided by Mr. Lack?
He had me develop the curriculum. After all, he was a very busy man, and too busy really to be developing curriculum for the part-time students. So I think he did ask me to submit an outline for review so that he knew what I was up to.
Great. And what did you refer to develop your curriculum?
Well, one of the anatomy books that we used a great deal was Richet's Anatomy, the French
Yes.
text.
Yeah.
And there was a book by the Englishman Harold Speed, The Practice and Science of Drawing,
Fantastic. Yeah.
which was not about anatomy so much as about principles of drawing, but also there was some good information in there about composition. Also, his book, Oil Painting Methods and Techniques.
Yes.
And there were some other anatomy books around at the time that were current. There was one by the American artist Robert Beverly Hale,
Yep.
and some older texts as well.
Fantastic. Now, I understand you also received instruction from Stephen Jertson. Can you provide some information as to your experiences training with him?
Well, Steve was very thorough in his teaching, and his eye for detail and for detecting slight variations from nature in a student's work was exceptional. I think Steve's most outstanding traits are his directness, earnestness, and sincerity. You might not always like or agree with him, but he always called it just like he saw it.
Lovely. Lovely. Moving on. Brian Lewis and yourself co-founded Bougie Studio in 1988, which was a teaching studio based on the working methods and principles that you gained whilst training with Mr. Lack. The studio was located on the second floor of a commercial building south of downtown Minneapolis in the Whitler neighborhood in close proximity to the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Can you provide a detailed description of how Bougie Studio came to be established?
Okay, I'm just going to say it's not the Whitler neighborhood, but the Whittier neighborhood.
Oh, sorry, my mistake.
No, it's all right. But to answer your question, Brian and I did not establish the studio.
Okay.
George Herman, who was a skilled and popular instructor of still life and portrait painting
Yes.
at Atelier Lac, he taught night classes and part-time classes there, founded it.
I see.
With the help of some persons that he knew, including myself. In the early going, I helped with putting together the infrastructure and with some of the teaching.
Okay.
Now, George had other interests that eventually drew him away from this venture to the point that by the third year of operation, I assumed full responsibility for it. And it was at that point that we changed the name to the Bougie Studio and basically started over. So Brian came on board as a teacher in, I think it was 1990 or 91, and he and I worked together the rest of the way.
Great. So prior to the school being titled Bougie Studio, what was its title?
So originally it was titled Atelier Herman, then for a while it was called the Herman Bougie Studio.
I see. Sure. Great. Now, I understand the studio was divided into separate rooms for different areas of training. Can you walk me through Bougie Studio?
Sure. About 40% of the space was dedicated to the life drawing room.
Okay.
We had a north-facing skylight installed, and if I do say so myself, it was the best natural light of any of the ateliers in the Twin Cities.
Wow.
We also had artificial lights for working at night, and for some of the other students' projects in their cubicles, as we called them, their private spaces, which were opposite the life drawing room, opposite side of the wall that kind of divided the space in two.
Okay.
And students did their private projects in their cubicles under artificial light. Sometimes they would work out in the life room in the afternoon, collaborating on head studies and so on under natural light.
Sure.
And Brian had his studio in that space adjacent to the life room.
Okay.
It faced out down the street on Nicollet Avenue. And there was another room overlooking the street that George occupied as a studio for some time. And when he left, we used it as an area for advanced students to work on various projects.
I see. Sure. Great. And was your actual layout of the school based on from Atelier Lac's model?
Well, somewhat. I mean, in the terms of how we divided up between the life room and the student spaces. The layout of the space was quite a bit different than Atelier Lac, but basically we devoted as large an area as we could to the life room,
Sure.
and we were quite particular about getting the skylight oriented properly. But basically, the layout was designed in order to facilitate the type of program that we had at the atelier.
Fantastic. Lovely. Now, I understand Mr. Lewis had a studio in the building. Did you have your own as well?
No, during the first 2 years of operation, before it became the Bougie studio, I did.
Sure.
Uh,
Okay.
but after that, I did not. Uh, Brian occupied the studio that I had during the first 2 years.
Okay.
However, throughout the course of the time the studio was in operation, I did a lot of figurative work there, or I did all of my figurative work there, I should say.
Okay.
Um, in the life room, I'd work in the afternoons and worked regularly in the evenings under artificial light as well.
Sure.
And that work was really invaluable for sharpening my eye and developing visual sensibilities.
Fantastic. Now, what do you think are the advantages of having your studio within such an environment as an atelier?
Well, from my own, of course, again, I didn't have my studio there, but from working there frequently, I found it was good to have interaction with the students and for them to see the sorts of things that I was doing and that Brian was doing. Now, painting is a very solitary activity oftentimes, and
Mm-hmm.
it's good, I think, to have some kind of situation that helps you get out of your shell
Absolutely.
regularly. So if you can become very insular, if you're always alone, thinking your own thoughts without ever bouncing them off anybody else, and so I think it's a good idea if you're teaching to have some sort of arrangement where at least some of your work is done around your students.
Sure. Great. That's great advice there, Peter. Now, I understand that advanced students were sometimes allowed to work on transfer drawings and underpaintings for their instructors' paintings. This very much imitates the apprenticeship system of training painters, which had its origin in the Italian Renaissance bottega or workshop. What do you find to be the benefits of allowing students to work on their instructors' paintings?
Well, we had students do some limited transfer and underpainting work on occasion, but it
Sure.
was not a regular part of the program. Um, After all, to be honest, we were not a true workshop in the sense of turning out commissions and so forth.
Sure.
So there wasn't a lot of opportunity for that kind of work. As for advantages, I think obviously for students, it is having the opportunity to gain experience working on an advanced project under close supervision and instruction. And for instructors, it's an opportunity to teach at an advanced level.
Fantastic. Great. Lovely. Lovely advice. Now, regarding the progression of training at Bougie Studio, the following curriculum was enforced. Neophyte students executed painstakingly slow, methodical academic drawings of single light source illuminated plaster casts. Skills learnt from this initial phase of training were transferable to subsequent exercises, namely figure drawing, which was held every morning for 3 hours, 5 days a week. Full-time beginning students usually began life drawing right away, devoting half a day to it and half a day to casts or working from flat copies. To supplement cast work, the neophyte carried out master copies from the flat of anatomical plates and master drawings. After competence in cast drawing had been developed, the neophyte moved on to grisaille cast painting to further refine their skills in discerning tones and to also familiarize themselves with paint handling. After cast painting, the neophyte approached head studies in charcoal and subsequently in oil and or pastel. At this point, still life painting and landscape sketching were also taken up, however, the latter was informally taught. For final year students, they were tasked with projects that required them to combine still life, portraiture, and figure work into interior genre composition, or to combine figure into a landscape, as an entry point into higher order picture making. Critiques were given twice a week on the long pose in charcoal, oil, or pastel in the life room, and once a week on the short pose in pencil. Each student had his or her private projects looked at approximately twice a week. Now, is this description of the Bougie Studios curriculum accurate? Is there anything I have left out?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate description. Full-time beginning students usually began life drawing work right away. alongside their cast work, devoting half a day to that and half a day to cast. So working from flat copy. Now, flat copy was something we didn't have students doing in the earlier years, and that was something that we began to have them do in the later years more than in the early years.
That's interesting.
Grisaille cast painting was, in addition to what you noted about developing an appreciation for the wider range of value possible in paint as compared to charcoal and chalk.
Sure.
And pastels were a traditional phrase, transitional phase, for many students, but not for all students. Landscape sketching was never a formal part of the curriculum, as you said, although I did take students out on a few occasions. Critiques were given twice a week on the long pose, as you said, and once a week on the pencil pose.
Sure.
And yeah, I think that your description sums it up quite well. Yeah.
Great. So, Peter, just to clarify there, you mentioned that the drawing from a flat wasn't really given to beginning students, but to students in their later years. Now, why is that so?
No, I'm sorry. What I meant was that in the earlier years of the studio, we didn't have the beginning students doing so much copying from flat work, and in the later years of the studio, we began to have the beginning students do more of that type of copying from flat work.
Great.
So it wasn't that we had the advanced students doing it, but that we didn't have that. We leaned more towards copying from the flat work as we went along in time working in the studio.
I see. Sure. Thanks for clarifying that, Peter.
Certainly.
Did imaginative painting have any place in Bougie Studio's curriculum?
Well, I think it was as described, or at least intimated previously, it was limited. The best that most students can hope for in a 4-year program is basic grounding in fundamentals.
Absolutely.
And some exposure to the variety of work that is possible.
Sure.
We had Steve Jertson come in and work with a couple of the advanced students on some imaginative painting projects near the end of the studio's tenure.
Okay.
But we found, and Lack had always emphasized too, that there wasn't a lot of latitude in the 4-year part of the program to allow for imaginative painting. That it was really, you needed it all that time just to get a grasp of the basic fundamentals of the craft.
Absolutely, and that makes perfect sense as well. Now, along with the core curriculum, I understand lectures would sometimes take place at various times throughout the year. Who used to provide the lectures, and what was the subject of them?
Well, I did most of the lectures, and the main topics were anatomy and composition. On occasion, we would have a guest lecturer come in and present on a topic.
Sure. Do you care to comment on who some of those guest lecturers were?
It's I believe we had Joe Paquette come in once and talk about composition. Joe is a landscape painter, and he had worked, very accomplished landscape painter, and he had worked in the commercial art world for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very, very thorough and intimate knowledge of composition.
Sure.
One presentation we had that I remember that was rather unique was we had some folks from Sennelier Paint.
Okay.
They were in town. They were in town from France, and they were doing some kind of a promotional tour for their painting products. And we had them come in and give a talk about they talked about the history of Sennelier paints and their relationship with the early Impressionists and so on, but and about their product and how it had evolved, and
great,
and what they were making these days. So.
Sure, fantastic, lovely. Now, I understand there were 2 different approaches to drawing the academy at Bougie Studio. Firstly, Peter, do you mind explaining exactly what an academy is for listeners that may not be familiar with the term?
Well, what is traditionally known as an academy, we called the long pose. It was a drawing or painting of the nude under natural light, life drawing,
Mm-hmm.
a variety of life drawing.
Sure.
The long pose was done in charcoal and chalk by beginners, in oil grisaille or pastel by intermediate students, and in oil full color by advanced students.
Absolutely.
Most years, we would do two poses of 16 or 17 weeks each. Now, that's a long time, but maybe not as long as it sounds. At 9 hours a week for 17 weeks, it comes to 153 hours,
Wow.
or it's a little less than 4 full 40-hour work weeks.
Wow.
So beginning students would do poses that were about half that long and then switch places with another beginning student in the life room and do another drawing of the same pose from a different vantage point. We started doing that at some point in our curriculum when we um, realized that quite a few of the beginning students just didn't have enough, just weren't developed enough in their eye and in their drawing skills to work on a drawing for such a long period of time. So
Sure. Great. Now, just in reference to the long pose, the academy drawing long pose. Now, that's very much a Davidian concept, right? The painter Jacques Louis David introduced that in the 19th century in École des Beaux-Arts. Is that right, Peter?
yeah, as far as I know, yes.
Yeah, sure. Now, concerning the two types of approaches that were taught of figure drawing at Bougie Studio, the first approach involved the academy being drawn at 24 to 30 inches tall in charcoal, pastel, or oil. It was to be completed over a course of weeks with the intention of bringing the drawing to a high level of resolve. The second approach involved drawing the academy smaller, at 9 to 11 inches tall, and they were to be completed solely in pencil. Working time was also reduced to a total of 6 to 9 hours, making up 2 to 3 live sessions. The logic behind the second approach is clear. Since the drawings are small in scale, any measurement that is slightly off can misrepresent a limb or facial feature. Therefore, all shapes and forms need to be accurate as possible, as mistakes are easily noticeable. Are you able to further elaborate on these two distinctive ways of approaching the drawing of the academy?
Well, the smaller pencil drawings, um, Lack always emphasized that they were really an excellent way to develop the eye for the perception of shape.
Sure.
And, we had the students work on them for about 6 hours at a time. So there'd be a different pose every week. So you're working two mornings a week, 3 hours per morning, 6 hours for a pencil pose. It also, I felt, gave a little bit more of a sense of urgency to the work. In the atelier style, everything seems to take forever. And,
Yes.
Shorter poses altered the pace of the work, gave students something fresh to do every week, and relieved some of the sameness associated with the atelier work in general.
Absolutely.
But the most important thing about it was what I mentioned about Lack, and he used the term. He always talked about digging out shapes with the point of the pencil.
Mm-hmm.
And this ability, as it's developed in drawing the nude in a small format, or in drawing the head in a small format for that matter, with a pencil, is applicable to all types of work, whether it's figurative, portraiture, or landscape. Whether you're working with the brush or whatever you're working with, it really develops the capacity to see and render shapes precisely.
Sure. Lovely. Now, I understand the pastel medium was often used by Mr. Lack, and pastel painting was reflected in the curriculum at Bougie Studio. The use of pastels can be beneficial to a student's understanding of color theory, as pastel sets are arranged in gradated values, or tones as we call them in Australia. This helps scaffold students' learning towards the added complexity of dealing with wet pigments and mixing colors directly on the palette. Can you further elaborate on the place of pastel painting in Atelier Lack's and Bougie Studio's curriculum?
Well, it really goes back to what Lack taught about color value.
Mm-hmm.
Learning to perceive color and value as a unified phenomenon and not as two separate concepts that must be somehow combined. I can't emphasize enough how critical and fundamental this is.
Mm-hmm.
Most, but not all, but most students struggle learning to see color value. The human eye, and our minds for that matter, I think, are not wired to see that way. We're wired, now this isn't scientific, this is just my observation about it, but I think we're wired, in fact, to perceive very slight differences in color and value, but there is a mental process that emphasizes the differences because it helps us to do all kinds of things that require us to make fine discriminations in craft or in observation of the natural world or whatever. And it probably helps us perceive slight differences in facial expression, in the facial expressions of others, and their body language, and all kinds of details that help us make judgments about our surroundings. But to make two-dimensional images that resemble three-dimensional reality, we have to learn to see the unity in areas of light and shadow. And the nature of the pastel medium, which you described as being, each color in the on the palette in the pastel set is laid out in 5 or 6 or 7 tones of gradated value from light to dark. It really helps to facilitate that learning to see color and value as a single phenomenon.
Fantastic. And that's a really logical explanation as well. Now, today, most contemporary ateliers and academies offer a 4-year program with an additional 5th year for specialist study where students can focus intensely on a specific genre of their liking. Was this format followed at Bougie Studio?
Yes, basically, except we had no formal format for 5th year study. Some students continued fundamental studies into the 5th year and even beyond that. If you don't master fundamentals, you're not going to go anywhere anyway. So
Sure. And was it basically the 5th year, was it just dedicated to, portraiture, interior, genre painting, landscape painting? Is that correct?
That's correct. If a person, not landscape painting so much, again, with a landscape painting, we had no formal program for it, and all students were encouraged to do it. We didn't have a formal program for it. But if students were staying for a 5th year, they were generally doing the type of things that they had been doing in their 4th year, maybe at a little bit more advanced level.
Sure, great. Now, did Bougie Studio have any other instructors at any point, or was it always Mr. Lewis and yourself?
Well, George Herman, as mentioned earlier, taught the first 2 or 3 years, and Bob Bonowitz also taught during that time.
Sure.
And later on, it was just Brian and myself. Occasionally, we would have a guest lecturer, as I said, and in our final year, which I also mentioned previously, Steve Jertson would come in regularly to work with a few of the advanced students.
Great, so it was quite a small school you had.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, great. Now, you and Mr. Lewis were also firm believers in breaking up some of the more rigorous, time-consuming academic exercises with faster, more freer ones. Are you able to explain how this paradox helps the neophyte student?
Well, I think part of it is what I was talking about earlier with the shorter-term life drawings is that it changes the pace and gives them something different to work on, just kind of freshens their outlook. But it also depends on the student. It was more helpful to some than to others. For some, it offers relief from the rigorous demands of the academic work. And some find that while working more loosely is a nice break, it is not as satisfying as their more disciplined studies. And in that sense, I think it often helps them to rededicate themselves to the disciplined studies.
Sure.
So they go back to the demanding work, excuse me, with an appreciation for its benefits. And as they become more advanced, they might find ways to apply what they learned under discipline to more spontaneous works as well.
Great. Yeah, that's a really resourceful strategy. Fantastic.
Well, thanks.
Being the director of an atelier can sound like somewhat of a romanticized, old-world notion. However, it's quite the multifaceted job. You've mentioned in another context that, quote, an atelier director already performs a job description that reads teacher, bookkeeper, office manager, school counselor, bill collector, janitor, handyman, in addition to making their own art. It's no task of the faint of heart, unquote. How did you find the challenging task of being co-director of Bougie Studio?
As you say all that, I think of the old saying, "Jack of all trades, master of none." So, it certainly sounds like a big job. But I guess when I was doing it, you just do what you have to do when it comes up. And, it was a small school, so it's not like every day I have all these things to do. There are things that, during the summer when we weren't have classes, that's when we would make physical improvements to the infrastructure and do the carpentry work or the space improvements or whatever. And then every year or two, we'd do a fundraising event, and that would require another set of skills to be coming into play. And I had an accountant who actually took care of the books and the quarterly reports. I really just had to provide the information to him to help with that. So it was what I wanted to do when I set out to do it. I did it for a long time, and on the whole, I enjoyed it. I've done various kinds of work in my life, and I found the most overwhelming work is always the kind you don't want to be doing in the first place. So,
Sure,
in the end, I simply didn't really have the kinds of abilities I needed to be able to continue to do that work, and the work has to pay, and I couldn't make it pay. So,
sure. So did you find that you had sufficient time for painting during the years that you ran the atelier?
yeah, I painted quite regularly. I always made quite a point to have um, several hours of working from the model every week because I had the studio, the life room available for that, and I continued my landscape painting out of my home. And yeah, there were times when we were really busy doing things at the studio when the painting just got set aside, and I didn't do very much painting for weeks or maybe a couple months at a time. But uh, generally, I kept at it. Yeah.
Sure, good, fantastic. Now, at its height, what was the total number of students enrolled at Bougie Studio at a given time?
Well, we had as many as 12 full time with two or three part timers besides. That would be about the maximum that we had.
Fantastic, good. So it wasn't an overwhelming amount of students that you had to manage.
No,
Good.
no.
I particularly enjoyed this quote in which you describe the nature of academic training. Quote, "Today's mistake, this morning's failure, is the ground from which success will grow tomorrow. I like to tell students that this training takes the time that it takes. Each challenge requires of you what it requires of you. There is no bargaining with it, and there is no accomplishment at the end of a shortcut. In a very real and profound sense, the student must submit to the requirements of the discipline in order to emerge as a master of it." Unquote. However, in my experiences, Peter, students can sometimes lose sight of the benefits of academic training, and this inevitably results in them stagnating and becoming stale on the given exercise. Did you encounter this problem throughout your time teaching?
Yes, exactly. Both in my teaching, but also first in my own development as an artist, and
Sure,
in my own training. So it's hard to keep going back to something when you're struggling with it, and when you've lost the joy of it, and that happens sometimes. And
absolutely.
you have to have a kind of faith in the process that at the end of the difficulties there will be the satisfaction of doing some good work. Some students don't make it past that phase, and that has that has to be all right. They're probably not meant to be doing, or they probably are meant to be doing something else if that's the case. So
And what was your remedy for for students like that that would come to you that would be a bit disheartened by the struggles of this kind of training? Would you just sit down and talk to them?
yeah, it would be different in each case. Sometimes you sit down and talk to them, and some people you would need to emphasize that they needed to keep at it, and it just depended on the type of person and personality you were talking to. Some people you needed to keep them to keep staying at it, and some people you needed to tell them to take a break because they were putting too much energy into it and they had gotten too overly focused on it. So it would depend on the individual.
Sure, great. I understand the site size approach to measuring was utilized at Bougie Studio. The majority of students who were trained by Mr. Lack stand by site size as a valuable, methodical approach to measuring. The late Robert Douglas Hunter spoke well of site size, which was passed on to him via Eyes Gamel. When speaking of Mr. Gamel, Mr. Hunter stated, quote, "One of the most important things he taught me was working site size. I had never heard of it before. None of us had ever heard of it before. It was most enlightening and most enabling. It was the single most important thing. Unless your eye was screwed up or you were lazy, you could see shapes better. You could make them better." Unquote. Furthermore, I particularly enjoyed this quote whereby you justify your reasoning for maintaining site size as a valuable teaching tool. Quote, "I have sometimes heard students mistakenly refer to site size as a theory, but a theory is made in the absence of sufficient evidence. Site size is a well-known and proven method for taking measurements in a setting where the model is posed or the subject is stationary. It's a tool. It is no more theoretical than a pencil or a paintbrush. It's useful when it's used in the right way. Above all, the site size method is used to help students develop and improve their eye, and as they advance their problem-solving skills." Unquote. In today's atelier movement, the site size debate remains ongoing. Some artists favor it, others prefer comparative measurement. Do you think site size should be utilized throughout the entire life of a painter or only in their training phase?
Well, I think that's up to each artist. I mean, this ongoing site size debate, it does kind of amaze me that people get so passionate about it. I mean, it's like people arguing about what kind of hammer they're going to use. I don't believe that the site size technique is indispensable to everyone. If that's what you're asking. So, for instance, I don't use site size at all in my landscape work.
Okay.
Um, Somebody told me early on, and I don't recall if it was Richard Lack or Steve or Don Kestner, that site size was impractical for landscape work.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about it, when you're using site size in the studio, you have a spot where you stand and the spot is marked and your easel is in a specific place and it's marked, and you walk back and forth from your spot where you measure to your painting where you paint. And that's practical in the studio, but not really out in the field for landscape painting. So for landscape painting, I've always used comparative measuring techniques.
Sure. Yeah. Great. And that makes perfect sense as well. And
Yeah,
being out, amongst the elements in nature, it's very hard to maintain that regime of walking back and forward whilst you've got the wind blowing, whilst you've got insects, biting you and the sun glaring on you. Sometimes it does make sense to just to use comparative measurement because it's more logical.
yeah, and I think there's got something to do with just the scale of your subject compared to the scale of your painting as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But as for studio work, I still use site size in the early stages of work in combination with comparative measuring. But once the drawing and composition are established, I do not use it much unless I get off track and I
Sure.
have to backtrack to solve some problem. But I think the greatest value of site size is in its use as a teaching technique
Yes.
because it creates a reasonably objective point of view for the student and teacher to share and from which to make verifiable observations and comparisons between nature and the work at hand. So a teacher then can show a student how far off something is, and not resort to talking about the feel of the thing so much at the level of fundamentals. Although to talk about the feel of the thing certainly has its place, but
Absolutely. And that's it right there. It's an objective teaching tool.
correct, exactly. That's the way I looked at it, and I think that's its greatest value.
Sure. I understand Mr. Lewis and yourself would adjust and modify the program at Bougie Studio as you saw fit. For instance, one of the decisions you made early on was to start neophyte students creating head drawings in charcoal once they showed more development in basic cast work. Can you elaborate on how you would do this while still maintaining integrity to Mr. Lack's legacy?
Well, with all due respect to Richard Lack, our first concern was not his legacy. So, nor do I think his first concern was ever Gamel's legacy. And he never claimed to be the beginning and end of knowledge concerning traditional training. So, a teacher's first concern is to help his students. So,
Sure.
taking the example you cite within the context of what we learned in our own training from Richard Lack, it seemed a logical development to put beginning students to work on head studies in charcoal relatively early on with the idea that they would struggle and it would help them see the value of remaining diligent about their cast work. At the same time, they would apply what they had learned in casts to drawing ahead and perhaps also see ways in which that first experience of cast drawing did not much inform the second experience of drawing ahead. Now, for example, casts always remain perfectly still, and they don't prepare you for how to deal with a moving target like a live model sitting for a portrait.
Sure.
So, having said that, we are always respectful of the tradition we are always respectful of the tradition. We always had it in mind. We strove to maintain it in fact and in spirit. So, Lack often talked about how much had been lost and how we didn't even know how much had been lost, and that it would take more than a generation or two to rebuild what was not just lost but willfully destroyed.
Sure.
Modernism has done this to tradition in every area of life, in art, in religion, in politics, in education, you name it. It has been extremely destructive, arrogant regarding its own virtues, and dismissive of what has been done by those who came before us.
Sure.
Um, but I'm kind of getting on my soapbox there. So,
Well, you've done a really good job of justifying how you would adjust curriculum there according to Mr. Lack's legacy. So thank you, Peter.
okay, okay.
You're noted in saying, quote, by reading a student's strengths and weaknesses, we can adapt the program's exercises to help them understand what is needed to achieve the next level of complexity, unquote. In an atelier setting, how do you go about differentiating your teaching for students with varying degrees of competency?
Well, an atelier setting is ideal for that. Most of the teaching is done in direct personal interchange between teacher and student, one on one. So you go around, you talk to everybody about whatever they're doing and whatever in whatever stage of the process that they're in. So when you go around in life class critiquing, you look at each person's work individually and speak directly to the level of the work they are trying to accomplish. The small size of the student body facilitated personal exchange in that way, and questions also in lecture settings as well.
Absolutely, great, fantastic. Now, during the late 1980s, the Bougie Studio and Atelier Lac in Minnesota, as well as Studio Sisu and Graves in Florence, Italy, were some of the few places in the world that offered an academic system of drawing and painting instruction that was ontologically committed to 19th century studio practices. At approximately the same time, another atelier was established in Minnesota by Annette Lesueur, which was titled Atelier Lesueur. Now, I understand that you and Mr. Lewis were running Bougie Studio, and Richard Lack was directing Atelier Lack with the help of Sid Wicker and Dale Redpath, whilst Annette Lesueur directed Atelier Lesueur. Considering that all of you were trained under Mr. Lack and were subject to his traditionalist inclinations at various points between the late 1970s through to the mid 1980s, I would imagine that the teaching styles of the schools would have been homogenized. For instance, all three schools upheld the use of site-size approach to measuring, and all schools followed in the footsteps of the Boston School in directly observing the color note from nature, seeing the big look of light and shadow, and paying close attention to the warm and cool vibrations in a mass of color. Did you find that there were deviations in the aesthetics of the three Minnesotan schools at all?
Well, first, just one thing about Atelier Lesueur. They were founded, or Annette founded that school. I'm not sure when, but she already was. Uh, Her school was already founded by the time I started studying at the Atelier in 1930 or 1983.
Okay,
So, so she was around quite a bit longer than, or quite a few years before the Bougie studio started. But as
sure.
far as your question goes, I think any student from that time who ever visited each school could probably tell you more about how they were different than I could. But generally, of course, we shared a common approach in many ways, like the use of site size as you tread and the general progression of the exercises that made up the curriculum and so on. The varying strengths and experiences of the several teachers involved made for differences in how teaching and information was delivered and in what was emphasized. And that out at her school always had classes for kids,
Yep,
and she had a more developed course in composition and illustrational or illustrative art, illustration art, than we had nothing like that. So,
I
so
see.
that's that. Those are some of the ways that they vary.
Sure. Did all three schools share a relationship with each other?
Yeah, on occasion we'd help each other out with various things like fundraising exhibits. For some years, students from the atelier came to my studio for anatomy lectures, and when I was a student in the early '80s, Annette Lesueur came to the atelier to give anatomy lectures. And teachers and directors from each school generally made the rounds for the student shows. Those are the kinds of interactions we had.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Mhm.
Some contemporary ateliers and academies today have developed some rivalry based on the superiority of certain lineages, working methods, principles, and ideologies. Did you and Mr. Lewis consider Atelier Lac and Atelier Lesueur to be your competition?
Sure, and they considered us the same way, I'm sure. We were often competing for the same students, and especially when those students came from out of town. Those folks generally wanted to visit all the local schools if they came to the Twin Cities from elsewhere. And don't forget that Joe Paquette and Jeff Hernenko taught together in St. Paul for some years. And there was also the River School down in Burnsville, another atelier style offshoot that operated during that time as well.
I see. Was Joe Paquette's school an atelier school?
Yeah, he did not run the school the same way we did, but it was and he placed quite a strong emphasis on landscape painting.
Sure.
So he took his people out landscape painting quite regularly. But he was teaching them one-on-one.
I see, sure. Between 1988 to 1990, you taught landscape painting at Atelier Lesueur. Can you provide a detailed description of your approach to teaching landscape painting?
Well, I tried to get people to adhere to a particular palette, so we had some common ground and consistency to work from, color palette, that is. And I advised on the type of brushes and tools they ought to bring. Um, and getting out into nature, I critique them on shape, color, and value as I would in the studio. Otherwise, obviously, sketching in oil demands a broader, more summary approach than what we were doing in the studio. I didn't have any systematic training in landscape painting myself, and in turn, I didn't have a really thoroughly prescribed system for teaching it.
Sure. Now, did you just ask students to meet you out in the field, or would you all drive out together? How did that work?
Sure, we usually, if we were going to go somewhere, it was usually a case of, well, we'll meet out at X destination at certain time, and then we'll go from there, hike out to wherever, and do some painting.
Great, fantastic. Now, you have also been affiliated with the Minnesota Center for Arts Education in Golden Valley, Minnesota, where you taught figure drawing. I would imagine that in such a context, time can be limited, and students do not have the luxury of working on their drawings for extended periods. Do you offer a fast-track curriculum in such a setting?
No. I taught at the Arts High School for one school year. Time we had to do the work was very limited. And so what the students received was a very rudimentary exposure to traditional classical methods. And as far as the fast track was concerned, I would say that there is no such thing as a fast track. And, if there were, everyone would use it, but there isn't. As I've said so many times to students, that all this stuff takes the time that it takes. People need to respect the whole process that way. So.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that you taught in a high school for a year. Is that right, Peter?
That's correct, yes.
And you were teaching atelier-style art training in this school. And could you just explain a little bit about how you found that year?
Well, I think that year was kind of a fiasco, actually. Maybe not a fiasco. That might be a strong word for it, but it certainly was not a successful experiment. They were kind of the Arts High School, I think, was picking up on the trend towards the interest in classicism and atelier style training, and they wanted to get somebody in there who could teach life drawing. Well, we weren't going to have the high school students drawing from the nude, so we had students posing in leotards and so on, which was fine. But you'd have 50 people in a classroom and 55 minutes to get around and critique everybody. So it was not a real meaningful experience for anybody.
Sure. It's very hard to facilitate atelier training in a classroom setting such as a high school.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Bougie studio ceased in 2003. Can you explain the reasons for its closure?
Well, firstly, I was never successful in establishing relationships with persons who might have helped the studio financially. In other words, I wasn't successful cultivating patrons.
Okay.
That's the type of background. That type of background support is really essential for the long-term health of an atelier or any type of school. They're always colleges and universities are always going after alumni for funds and trying to establish endowments and so on. And I was never successful at doing that. Secondly, on a strictly practical level, in 2003 at the studio, we faced a new lease on the space we occupied. With rents escalating on a schedule annually in a neighborhood of the city that wasn't very good when we first moved in there, but that had improved a lot over the years, so it was becoming a more desirable neighborhood, and hence the rents were going up. So I had no confidence in my ability to meet those terms by continuing in the way I had always operated. Third, I was in my late 40s at the time. I had some financial and health problems, and I needed a regular job with health insurance.
Sure.
And finally, I was also tired of the vain and contentious nature of the art world, including the realist art world, and I was disillusioned with my own vanity and contentiousness as well. So I was kind of burned out, and those are the reasons for closing the studio.
Sure. That's really interesting. Peter. So, do you mind if I ask, what did you do, in regards to earning an income after closing the studio?
Well, I went to work for a remodeling company in St. Paul as a lead carpenter, and I ran home, residential remodeling projects for many years.
I see. Right. Great. Great. Now, one of the reasons Mr. Lack established Atelier Lack in 1969 was due to a deep feeling of responsibility that he had of passing on his body of knowledge to future generations of students in order to maintain the tradition as a living one. Did you feel a similar sense of obligation when you were directing Bougie Studio?
Well, actually, I was the director, not the co-director, although I regularly took counsel with Brian and with the members of the board of directors about many matters concerning the operation of the studio.
Okay.
And as for feeling an obligation to maintain the tradition, yes, I felt that, and I'm sure Brian felt that, but I think much less urgently than Lack may have felt it in 1969 when he started Atelier Lack, which at that time there wasn't anything else except Gamble out in Boston, or very little in the way of traditional training. By the time we were flourishing in the mid 90s, a lot of new opportunities for traditional training were coming into being. There were more people getting into it, more artists branching out from their training and teaching, and the traditions were rebounding. So it wasn't the same as when Lack started.
I see. Sure. I understand Mr. Lewis and yourself sought Mr. Lack's advice on various issues related to your teaching and work after his retirement in 1992. Do you care to share some of the issues you sought his advice on?
Sure, I consulted him about my own work, and I know Brian consulted about his. If I was thinking of tweaking the teaching regimen, I talked with him about that. I discussed that sort of thing with him. And we also worked together on the Classical Realism Journal for many years.
Sure.
And there were probably more discussions about the journal than anything else.
So when you would seek Mr. Lack's advice on some of your work, would you literally take your work, your paintings to him, or would he come to your studio?
No, I would take things out to his studio and um, have him take a look at them and tell me what he thought. What we were mostly talking about at that point was um, trying to fine tune and gain a deeper understanding of pictorial composition and advanced picture making.
Sure, great. Now, moving into your personal work, you mainly paint landscapes and figurative compositions. What is it about these genres that you find compelling?
Well, it was my desire to paint landscapes in the first place that caused me to seek training, because the beauty of the landscape has always been very moving to me from the time I was a teenager, I guess, on, and I had desire to communicate that through painting. I don't know how to express that desire very well. Maybe there's a mystery about things. We human beings have some understanding about nature and knowledge of it, but it's only partial. Painting is an art form well suited, I think, to expressing that sense of mystery that we find in nature.
Sure, lovely. You also paint commission portraits of homes and gardens. These are interesting subjects for commissions. What do you find appealing about them?
Well, my experience with landscape painting gives me a facility with these subjects, and the work pays and it helps put bread on the table. So,
Absolutely, great. And are you actively receiving commissions to this day?
yes.
Fantastic, great. You're noted in saying, quote, I hope that viewers of the work will recognize something in the representation and be moved by it. I hope they will recall seeing something similar, that pitch of a hillside, or line of a horizon, or the hue of a sky, and in recalling, recognize the movements of forces greater than ourselves in nature. This can't help but inspire some proper humility. Unquote. Now, what do you mean by recognizing the movements of forces greater than ourselves in nature?
Well, I'm a faithful Catholic, having been through a reconversion process beginning about 20 years ago. So ultimately, I'm talking about God. But there are many forces in nature between us and God, greater than us and subject to God. God is present in nature, sort of like an artist is present in their artwork in a way. I mean, this is kind of that's maybe not the greatest comparison, but in a sense, it's like that. God isn't personally present in nature, but manifest in the qualities of the nature and the qualities of nature and the qualities of creation. Nature, the universe, creation is profoundly mysterious. It both submits to and resists inquiries at once. artistic inquiries, scientific inquiries, metaphysical inquiries. We live in a postmodern materialistic culture that mostly dismisses the metaphysical, idolizes the scientific, and has a kind of fickle crush on the artistic. Forces greater than ourselves in nature would be think of like a northwest wind around here in this part of the world at this time of year is something to be reckoned with. It's deep winter right here now, and we had like 0 degrees this morning, and it's pretty cold. There are aspects of all this that are knowable and aspects that resist knowing. I think that's the best I can do in talking about it. I guess I'm saying that things that resist knowing, that resist being known or discovered, are forces that are greater than ourselves, including God, of whom St. Augustine famously wrote, "If you understood it, it would not be God." Painting landscapes is a way of knowing them, and when I look at a landscape someone else painted, it might trigger some knowledge I already have from some other experience, or provide some information that completes or makes richer some experience that I had that were not entirely complete. So it's moving and it's mysterious.
Wow, what a fine justification there, Peter. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I understand that your landscapes are direct responses to something you see in nature. What is your general process to landscape painting? For instance, do you paint pochades en plein air in preparation for more finished studio paintings, or is all of your work done out in the field?
Well, almost all my landscapes are one-day paintings, and their sizes range from 8 by 10 to 16 by 20. All of them are begun on site, and some of them are finished on site, and some of them are finished off site, usually in the hours immediately following the work on site, while my memory of the scene and the experience is fresh. I find that I can remember certain things, which means bringing a clear visual image to mind. When I say remember, I mean it's not just the general look of green leaves, but the specific shapes of something in the picture. I can bring those kind of images to mind if I make some notes on the painting in a kind of a shorthand, with the idea that I'll use them to develop the thing later. This is practical when light or conditions are otherwise changing. The shorthand makes sense to me, but usually, but not always. I don't always remember what I made one particular note or the other about. It's not systematic, and I couldn't explain it. I don't think I could teach it to anyone. Sometimes I have a kind of dyslexic reaction in front of nature. Flickering light or light on the water or the movement of water seems to overstimulate my senses sometimes and kind of scramble my brain, so to speak. But if that's the case, I have to leave a site at that point. But I probably still want to finish the painting. So sometimes I'll go back to the site on another occasion, but usually I'll finish it off-site from recall in the hours after I return from being on site. After 3 or 4 hours, my memory starts to become kind of generic, and generic might be okay for secondary passages in the picture, but I certainly don't want it in the center of interest, and I don't want to start making things up. I do a few paintings that'll take more than a day. In the past, I did a lot of mid-sized landscapes and a few large ones, and they would take 40 to 80 to 100 and more hours to do.
Wow.
They're a lot harder to sell than the small ones. They involve, obviously, a larger time commitment, and there are logistical complications going back to the sites and so on. So small paintings satisfy my desire to respond to the moment, and that seems to be what I'm best at. I think every artist should try to find what they are best at and do it. And then that may sound blatantly obvious, but very often people have ideas about what they want to do that blind them to what they are best suited to do. I think I was like that. I think it took me years to see what others saw after knowing me for a short time. So, that's my process in basics. Yeah.
Sure, so you mentioned that you use memory to finish works in the studio. Does photography have any place in your process?
Generally, no. Sometimes with the home portrait commissions, I'll take a photograph of the house to help me recall particular details of the architecture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to rely on photographs. I have tried doing paintings from photographs on occasion, and I find it to be extremely tedious work.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that it really inhibits the whole atelier style of training, which is really based on an interaction with life. And a photograph is something now that you're at a remove from life. It's something. It's a secondary source, not a primary source.
Sure.
So I'm not opposed to people, using photographs as a resource, but I'm not exactly sure how to tell them, how to talk about how to use them as a resource. But in my own work, they have a very minimal place.
Great. Fantastic.
And generally, I don't use them at all. But when I do use them, it's very, very minimal.
Great. Good. Good. Now, do you care to comment a little bit about your process of creating figurative works?
Well, working with models, I set up according to the standard atelier type principles in the studio. So we establish directional lighting, establish various reference points for maintaining the pose, both for the artist, or for the model, to reference points for the model, things for them to look at, things for them to think about when getting back into pose. And I work site size to establish the drawing. After the drawing is established, I use primarily comparative measurements. If I have a difficult problem, I will probably spend some time standing back from the work and comparing my drawing or painting to nature. So I'll just stand still and look back and forth. And in doing that, I usually start to see areas that in the drawing that look a lot different than nature. And when I have an idea of what's off, I might then use the plumb line, the site size, to help me resolve the difficulty.
Sure. And I'm presuming that your stance on photography is reflected in your figurative work as well?
Even more so, I don't use photography at all in the studio.
Lovely. Great. Good. I understand part of your work is dedicated to sacred Christian themes. At what point did you decide that you wanted to create work that celebrates the glory of God?
Only within the last few years have I done work with explicitly Christian themes. I'm very new to it, so I'm still endeavoring to find my feet, so to speak. I hope I can do a few things that are worth looking at before I'm done. Having said that, I like to think that my landscape work has for a long time borne witness to creation. And if we're talking about creation, then we are inferring a creator. As I said earlier, he is present in his work, what we call nature, which includes ourselves. So my landscape work could be summed up, I hope, as a witness to the beauty of nature and of love and respect and reverence for its creator.
Lovely. Fantastic. As a Christian artist, do you carry out any particular prayer or religious rituals prior to or whilst working on a painting?
No, just a simple prayer. Lord, guide my eye and my hand. Amen. That's all. So,
And is that generally at the beginning of every painting or just specifically the sacred works?
no, just generally at the beginning of everything, if I can be mindful and remember to do it. But sometimes I don't remember to do it until I get in trouble. So.
Okay, moving on. Over the years, you have exhibited your work in numerous group exhibitions, which include, although are not limited to, the American Artists Professional League at the Salmagundi Club in New York, the Oil Painters of America National Exhibition in Chicago, and the Legacy Lives exhibition in Manhattan. Do you find involving yourself with group exhibitions to be beneficial to your reputation?
I think it is to a degree. I haven't done any of that sort of thing for many years, but it does help flesh out a bio or resume. I think you need that kind of experience to place yourself in the art community at large, especially when you're starting out.
Absolutely. And do you think exhibiting is still an important part of your practice today, Peter?
It's not a very important part. I mean, we obviously exhibit to sell, but I do it on a much more private level than I haven't been involved in a public exhibit in probably 12 or 13 years. So,
Wow. Okay.
well, excuse me, I take that back. I have sent paintings off to a couple of things, but um, yeah, it's been a very peripheral part of what I do. So.
Sure, sure. Your landscape painting titled Four Oaks won a competition which was sponsored by American Artist magazine in August 1990. This saw your work being published in that month's issue. I imagine winning this competition would have advanced your reputation as a fine landscape painter. Did you find the publicity to be helpful?
Well, I think that that one was an honorable mention, and it was not the winner of a competition. There was a reproduction in the magazine, but it was not anything like a feature.
I see.
But having said that, getting your name and your images out there obviously always helps. I mean, however, I think once you've had some of that, it's much more important to develop good and sincere relationships with people that will help you buy or sell your art.
Absolutely. That's good advice. In Volume 1, Issue 2 of the 1994 release of the Classical Realism Journal, you were interviewed along with three other painters of the tradition. Who were these other painters and who was the interviewer?
I remember the article you're talking about, but I don't remember the interviewer. It might have been me, but I'm not even sure about that. And I don't remember the other artists involved either. I'd have to dig for that information.
Okay, no problem. We'll move on. In 1995, you became an associate editor of the Classical Realism Journal and you wrote numerous articles for the publication. What subject did these articles cover?
Well, I wrote articles on landscape painting and on training and teaching. I did a feature on Gamel and his students, interviewing several folks who had studied with Gamel around the time that Richard Lack did back in the early 1950s. I wrote a few articles about collections at the Frick and the Met in New York and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. I did several interviews with artists such as Frank Mason, Harvey Dinnerstein, Jeffrey Mims. I worked with Richard Lack on some things about his imaginative paintings. As editor, I worked closely with the art historian Gerald Ackerman, for several years on the articles that he contributed regularly to the journal, and also with Fred Ross of the Art Resource Center. I worked with the artist Jim Robinson on an article he did on Vermeer, and with the artist and former student of mine, Stephen Sweeney, who on the Australian painter Arthur Streeton,
Mm-hmm.
and worked with many others as well.
Peter, may I ask what compelled you to want to write or to maintain your writing?
Well, I've always liked to write, and I enjoy it. So to me, it's not for the most part, it's not a chore. It's something that I enjoy doing, and it's a whole different way of expressing yourself than painting is.
Sure. In 1997, you became editor of the Classical Realism Journal. I imagine this must have been a demanding role and would have ultimately taken much time away from painting. Can you reminisce what this period of your life was like?
Well, my artistic horizons expanded exponentially during this time, as I was doing so many things and meeting so many people that I had not a whole world that I had not had access to before. So I was privileged to be in contact with a lot of very talented, accomplished people and to see and hear firsthand about how they worked and what they had done. Um, However, ultimately, it was not the right kind of life for me, and I had to just let it go.
Sure, okay. Do you believe that Mr. Lack was hesitant to be involved with the Classical Realism Journal towards the end of his life because he wanted to commit his time solely to painting?
No, I think quite the opposite. I think he viewed the CRJ as crucial to promoting the establishment of standards and ideals in painting, and he was always quite interested to it all the way all the way along.
Okay, interesting. I understand you were a guild member of the American Society of Classical Realism. Can you provide some background information on this society, its genesis, philosophy, and members?
Well, I resigned from the guild in about 2003, about the time I closed the teaching studio. Uh, Steve Jertson is much better informed about things concerning the guild. I don't. It doesn't exist anymore. My view of it is that it was basically an association of like-minded artists interested in traditional artistic values. I can't speak specifically to its founding or establishment, as my knowledge of that is sketchy. I do recall that by the mid 90s, it was an association with a reputation for representing realist artistic values, and it was a desirable thing to belong to.
Sure. Was it quite popular or famous during its time?
I mean, in the world that I inhabited, it was quite well known. I think it became pretty well known in the realist art world at large. Yes.
Great. Regarding the definition of classical realism, Guild members of the American Society of Classical Realism believe, quote, that only creativity grounded in discipline and years of intensive training, built on a rigorous and comprehensive knowledge of the past, can produce genius and the masterpieces of tomorrow. That classical realism is rooted to the conviction that fine art is first and foremost about life, and most specifically about the dignity, beauty, comedy, tragedy, romance, fantasy, pride, and nobility of the human spirit, and all those precious and powerful emotions that form and define the human experience. That the core of great art is the emotional thrust, but that art only achieves greatness when the elements of the craft, drawing, composition, modeling, perspective, design, and color are brought together to support, enhance, and intensify that emotion. That classical realism encompasses the highest principles of traditional representational art from the ancient Greeks to the present day. These principles include fine drawing, balanced design, harmonious colors, and skillful craftsmanship. At its foundation is the representation of the visible world as seen through the trained eye of the artist. End quote. Now, these are very noble concepts, and the high standards that classical realists have are obvious. Do you share these beliefs, Peter?
Yeah, broadly speaking, but there's a lot there to comment on. I don't think it means much, for instance, to say that art is first and foremost about life, because many would respond, well, what else would it be about? You know, I think that statement, art is first and foremost about life, is made in opposition to some other position, namely modernism and postmodernism, and
Yes.
to a fundamental disagreement about what life is about, let alone what art is about. So there's no mention of the key role that the church played in the development of Western culture and any of that. We go straight, it seems, from the present back to classicism, and there's no mention of the spiritual and intellectual tradition that made all of this possible. And I think the eye of the artist doesn't see anything if these other things don't happen first. So,
Do you care to comment a little bit about on the church's relationship to the development of Western culture or of Western art in that fact?
the church, well, it's that's the Sistine Chapel. Is one of the obvious things, or the Vatican collection, or Raphael's murals inside the Vatican. And the church was a very great patron of the arts, and these techniques, the techniques that we're talking about. The atelier, as you mentioned earlier, the atelier tradition goes most specifically back to David, and he was a revolutionary. He wasn't a churchman, but he was very much attached to the ideals of the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
But the the drawing of the human figure, the representation of the figure in compositional settings that told stories, illustrated gospel stories or Bible stories. It was later on illustrating history and myth and so on. All of this was developed, or a lot of this was developed under the patronage of the church. And if the church hadn't been there to do it, I'm not sure, it might have still developed, but it would have developed in a very different way.
Sure. So, in other words, would you stand by the notion that the church was very influential in the survival of representational art throughout the ages?
Up until at least recent times, yeah, it's not so much anymore.
Yes. Yeah. Sure. Moving on. How would you define classical realism to a layperson?
Well, the term is widely appropriated these days, I think. I'm not sure what it means to others. To me, it represents the legacy of Richard Black. But I see it. I see it bandied about and kind of used generally as a term to refer to realist art that has academic influence.
Sure. Right. Now, in the same year that Bougie Studio ceased in 2003, you were the guest editor and writer for the Paramount publication of the Charles Bargue and Jean-Léon Gérôme drawing course, which was written by Gerard Ackerman and Graydon Parrish and published by ACR Edition. Can you tell me about your contributions to the book?
Well, I recall that I reviewed a set of the galleys that summer, and I made written comments and returned them to Jerry Ackerman. Now, at that time, I had a long established working relationship with Mr. Ackerman on the articles that he had submitted to the CRJ. He did quite a few of them for us over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Although we never met personally, we had a very good rapport communicating via email.
Sure. Great. What is your opinion of the Barg-Jerome plates?
I think they provide excellent flat copy exercises for students. They embody basic, timeless principles of academic drawing.
Now, did they have a place at all in Bougie Studio's curriculum?
We didn't have access to good plates in those days. So towards the end of our time of our run, the Barg-Jerome book was coming into being, and we had a few things that we used. Prior to that, when we wanted to do things from flat copy, I had made some plates, or not plates, but drawings of some renderings of charcoal drawings of cast that I called them 5 value studies, and so it just showed how light and shadow was separated and blocked in large, simple shapes as compared to the finished drawing. But we did not, to answer your question, we did not use them very much because they weren't readily available.
Sure. Now, how do you think the Barg-Jerome plates compare to the Bernard Romain Julien plates?
Well, the Bernard Romain Julien plates, I think they're beautiful and fascinating, but in my opinion, the Barg-Jerome plates are much better suited for use in instructing beginning students. They're just, they're all about fundamentals, and much more so than the Bernard Romain Julien plates.
Do you care to elaborate a little bit more on that, Peter? In what way? Why so?
Well, the Bernard Julien plates I shouldn't say too much about them because I'm not real familiar with them, but they seem to have a quality that's more, I don't know, sentimental, I think. There's a little different strain of the academic tradition going on there, and the Barg-Jerome plates really emphasize the foundational aspects of drawing, how to lay the thing out broadly and simply, and I think that's the difference as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Julien plates, to a degree, are a little bit more stylized, where the Barg-Jerome plates are strictly academic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on. Sorry, go on.
No, I would agree.
Oh, great, good. Current ateliers and academies, which are descendants of Mr. Lack's lineage, diverge somewhat with their teaching approaches, which is partly due to the varying personalities and prejudices of the school directors. Do you believe these inconsistencies are detrimental or beneficial to the tradition?
Well, I think it depends on what approach you are talking about. The tradition you mentioned it's not a singular entity like, say, the magisterium of the Catholic Church. It has a lot of different faces. So my question is, how do you even describe it? We were just talking a moment ago about the differences between the Barg-Jerome plates and the Bernard Romain Julien plates.
Mm-hmm.
So, however, if you're allowing modernist or postmodern principles to influence your program, you will have just another variety of modernist or postmodernist art, I think. You can hang it on classical forms, but it's still modernist or postmodern. Both these ideologies are good at appropriating forms for their own misuse. There's lots of realist artists who are highly accomplished in terms of technical skill, producing thematically postmodern art. Such work does not promote truth and beauty, in my opinion, no matter how beautiful it might appear, because postmodern theory does not allow for the existence of the true or the beautiful or of any transcendent value.
Great, that's a great description, Peter. However, putting postmodern and modern theories aside for a moment, if we just look at the current crop of ateliers and academies that are prevalent in our day and age, which are striving to achieve a kind of a realism that provides some reference to 19th century studio practices. There are some inconsistencies in the way that the principles are taught. And do you think, I suppose, having these little differences, is that something that's perhaps detrimental or beneficial to the tradition?
Well, I think it could be both. Not to try to evade the question, but it could certainly be beneficial to the tradition in the sense of providing a sort of cross-pollination between traditions, and in maybe getting each tradition to be a little bit less self-regarding, a little bit more open to some other aspect of the tradition as a whole. And they could be detrimental in as much as people uh, cling to them and invest their identities in them, and like to stand in their own camp and pound their own chest about it. I
Sure.
guess. Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Now, previously you mentioned that Mr. Lack would often talk about this notion that we have lost things about the actual technique and principles of traditional painting that perhaps we haven't reconstructed or even come close to rediscovering just as yet. Now, in your opinion, do you think we have reconstructed and discovered all there is to know about 19th century studio practices?
No, I don't think so. But I mean, my sample size is pretty limited, and anyway, I would ask, how would anyone know such a thing? Because
That's true. So, just in your own opinion, what do you think is missing, if there is anything missing?
well, the thing that's missing is the whole milieu in which these traditions evolved. Our modern culture um, is so different from the cultures that these traditions evolved from, that it's kind of mind-boggling to consider how different they are. And I think that's the biggest thing that's missing, is the whole cultural aspect of it, and the intellectual and spiritual aspects that were behind these traditions. I think are often uh, uh, very little considered, if they're even considered at all,
Sure,
at the expense of the technical and studio traditions.
sure. Now, a quote of yours I found to be very inspiring regarding landscape painting goes as follows, quote, "There is no possibility of improving on nature. We may speak of improving on nature in the sense of as it were, but really all we are talking about is composing a picture in our little two-dimensional format to communicate the truth of nature. We do not invent that truth, we are witness to it. If we depart from that truth, it will be evident and no improvement. So if you move a cloud shape in the scene you observe while making your painting to make a better composition, you are not improving on nature. You are composing a picture according to nature using the elements of nature at your disposal. You depart from the truth if you put that cloud shape in a spot where it could not occur in nature. For example, if you put the shape of a cloud that is nearby too close to a horizon which is far away, it will look like it ought to squash that horizon. It will serve you right because it doesn't belong there. Observe the truth and respect it." Unquote. Peter, let me ask you this. Many landscape painters edit certain aspects of a landscape to omit elements which may be unsightly. For instance, the Hudson School painters' landscapes can sometimes seem otherworldly and fantastical because they emphasized and exaggerated certain qualities of the landscape. Does this then mean that their work is not truthful?
Well, the game is on now. it seems that it seems to me that basically something can be untrue for one of two reasons, at least in terms of, or at least artistically. There is a deliberate attempt to deceive. One, there's a deliberate attempt to deceive. Um, I recently read somewhere that a lie is always an attempt to replace something with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Or it can be two, a mistaken or inadequate information is put forth without the intent to deceive. So there's two different types of untruth that can go out there. One is an intentional lie, and one is I guess, ignorance, basically. So I think that, to elaborate on that statement of mine you just quoted, that we discover the truth. When we make investigations of things with due process, we discover what is true. And obviously, the truth is not made up. But perhaps not so obviously, because in our contemporary sensibilities, we think we can make assertions about things. And then when we make the assertion that it is so, and others must respect the assertions, or our personal autonomy is violated. So in essence, everybody becomes a little god with a small g, and not a loving or just little god either, but rather a self-absorbed and tyrannical little god. I think we've dismissed God with a capital G as an impediment to our materialistic or sensualistic or political aspirations. I mean, I think it's a story that repeats itself throughout history, dressed in period costumes, as it were. So I guess I would ask you this: when you listen to Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, do you say, "Oh, wait a minute, who was this Figaro, and when did he actually get married?" And what does opera have to do with the truth? Is opera a lie? Or when you read The Lord of the Rings, do you put it down in disgust and say, oh, hey, Tolkien is full of crap. There is no such thing as Middle Earth. The very definition of fiction is imaginary events contrived in story form. So our novel's a lie. Speaking of the example you cited, the Hudson River School, they emphasize certain things at a specific historical moment in a particular culture. They emphasize the panoramic, the grandiose, and the romantic, certainly at the expense of the ordinary and to the exclusion of certain other realities like poverty or human greed or envy or what have you. But when you look at the best of their work, your eyes tell you that they witness to the height and breadth and beauty of nature. If you just have a glimpse of the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, you will recognize what the Hudson River School painters saw in them. So, sure, I think they tell the truth. It resonates. It strikes a note within you. As with most art, it's a particular truth and not the truth with a capital T. It's part of a bigger picture. So you can have both the Hudson River School and Impressionism, and one doesn't cancel the other out. Take plein air painting for another example. Imagine you're painting a plein air picture. You stand on a spot for 2 or 3 hours and you try to paint the scene before you. Maybe you come back more than once to finish the work. You make a whole series of observations over time. Meanwhile, the light keeps changing, and you come back a week later, and all those wildflowers you put in have gone to seed. They're not there anymore. But you keep working anyway to develop the painting, and you leave the expired wildflowers in it. Is your painting a record of the truth? You go to work to paint clouds in the sky. First thing you notice is they are definitely a moving target. They change faster than you can paint them. So you learn quickly to study their characteristics and to try to paint something that looks characteristic, because you can't study a cloud at leisure. Or nowadays, we technological moderns can take a photograph with our phone, crying out loud, but now you have a snapshot of one instant, not even a whole second, and that is only part of the truth, and likely, at least if you're me, a bad photograph. So you take observations from things and use them as you can. Are you telling the truth? How do you paint moving water? Well, you study it and you notice it does the same sort of thing over and over again. No two moments may be exactly alike, but there are lots of consistent similarities. I think with painting, obviously the look of it is the test of truth. We artists fail to represent the truth all the time. Sometimes it's from a lack of skill, and sometimes it's from carelessness. And sometimes you just miss. You aim, you pull the trigger, and you miss. It happens. Hopefully, it's never from a willful intention to misrepresent.
Fantastic, Peter. That's a fine justification there. And I think you've just touched on my second question in that answer. I was going to ask, can you elaborate on what you mean by, quote, art must always point towards a greater truth. Art is not itself the truth, unquote. But I think you have touched on that. But would you like to add anything else to my question?
I think modern art museums are mostly full of art that is self-referential.
Sure.
And it's art for art's sake. You are at least as likely to walk away feeling like you've gone to a peep show as you are to be edified.
Sure.
The Sistine Chapel is full of art that's done in a profound reverence for God. Having said that, the question isn't abstract versus real. It's truth versus lies, I think. Massive monumental fortress-like forms, architectural forms used to design a place of worship, for instance, is a kind of mockery of worship. It refuses to testify to the human need to worship, and it disrespects God. There is no inherent reason why abstract art can't be done reverently. I mean, architecture is a form of abstract art. Chartres Cathedral is an expression of reverential worship in abstract architectural form. Obviously, it also contains realistic sculptures and two-dimensional images. Music is abstracted from reality. Numbers are abstracted from reality. But along with recognition of the beauty of nature, the beauty and dignity of the human person, that's what art should serve. It should serve human needs, the dignity and the beauty and dignity of the human person. When art becomes art with a capital A, and we serve it, I think then it has become an idol.
Fantastic, and I agree with much of what you've just stated there, Peter. Thank you. Now, you maintain a blog where you write about your work and related ideas in depth. Why do you feel a need to do this?
Well, writing helps me to clarify what I think about things, and posting the writing on a blog for others to read gives me more incentive to do it. So it's a way to engage with others, albeit a very limited way. And it also helps me to get the images of my paintings out there.
Hmm.
So
Sure. So I noticed on your blog, you do talk a little bit about technique, but a lot of your writing tends to be a lot more targeted towards the philosophical side of art and specifically sacred art. Do you care to comment a little bit about that?
well, I think what I've been thinking in recent years is that um, I've touched on this a little bit already. I think that there's nothing, our great tradition grew out of artistic tradition in the European artistic tradition, grew up in a culture that um, was much more spiritually and philosophically oriented than our current culture is. Our current culture is very materialistic and um, well, I'll just leave it at that. It's very materialistic. So when we put these forms to work these days, when we do this type of representational art, what is motivating us? We're not motivated by the same thing. The big difference, it seems to me, between the present and the past um, certainly is manifested in the forms, but what's underneath the surface of the forms is, you know, I think a real um, metaphysical bankruptcy, for lack of a better term. So,
That's interesting. Really, really interesting. Your ideas are fascinating, Peter. Thank you for sharing them so far. Now, just moving on, regarding teaching, are you still currently teaching today?
no, I occasionally I give presentations, but otherwise I no longer teach.
Sure. And your presentations, what subjects do they cover?
Well, usually the presentations uh, will cover something about. I'm usually giving them to people. They're more on the topic of art appreciation
I see.
um, than they are on the topic of technique. Because I'm usually talking to people who aren't necessarily artists themselves, but who are interested in art.
I see. Sure. Great. What are your thoughts on the contemporary revival of realist art today?
Well, beyond what I've already said, I think that the dichotomy isn't abstract versus realistic. It is postmodern versus traditional, and not only in artistic form, but in cultural values. I mean, there's plenty of postmodernist art employing realistic forms. The skill is there, but it's often employed for trivial or even perverse purposes.
I see. Sure. So when you look at the current proliferation of ateliers and academies that are out there today, compared to the amount there were back when you were training at Atelier Lac, do you feel surprised at all, or do you feel thankful for the current revival? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised, a little bit that it has grown as much as it has, but not entirely because in the years when I was teaching and we had young people coming in interviewing for positions in the studio, it was clear that there was a real hunger for um, this kind of thing, for training that would provide some skill. And I think that underneath that yearning for the skill, there was yearning for greater meaning in life, and or not a greater meaning in life, but greater meaning in artistic training. That there's a real dissatisfaction with the glibness and the emptiness of postmodernism, and so I think that in a way it's been surprising to me, but in another way it seems that it's also inevitable because these things do tend to go in cycles, I think, and this cycle of modernism and postmodernism is busily playing itself out.
Sure, sure. And I think what you've just mentioned there, Peter, reminds me of something that a contemporary realist by the name of Adam Miller. Are you familiar with Adam Miller's work at all?
Adam Miller, no, I am not.
No, yeah. So he mentioned that just commenting on the whole idea of why the culture is returning back to appreciation of fine realism. He said, that I believe that the culture is returning to realism for the same reason as to why people are returning to Brussels sprouts, because they're malnourished.
That's right. That's a good way to put it.
So, bringing the interview to the current day, what are you currently working on nowadays?
Well, these days, I'm continuing to do landscape work on site, and I'm getting prepared to do a painting of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So,
Lovely. Wow. Can you tell me a little bit about that painting?
well, right now it's in a very early stage. I'm just having a costume maker make Mary's robes and veil, and I'm thinking that I will base the gesture of Mary on the Mary in the baptistry doors of the Florence Cathedral by Donatello. I'm going to use
Fantastic.
that as a basis for my gesture.
Lovely. And what's the approximate size of that canvas?
Well, it'll be a life-size figure, but it'll probably be from the waist up. It'll probably be something like a 24 by 30 canvas, something not huge, but good size.
Great, great. So, can you just explain a little bit about your current daily work routine, Peter? Are you in the studio, 5 days a week, 6 days a week? How's that work?
Oh no, I only work a couple days a week on artwork. I work several days a week as a carpenter to make the major part of my living.
Oh, I
And
see.
uh, so I work a couple of days a week on artwork, and try to get out at least once a week to do some landscape.
Lovely.
And I will be working on this Annunciation painting a good deal during the colder months here, and hopefully I'll have it pretty much done by this fall.
Sure. And I'm presuming that your studio is in your home?
That's correct, it is.
Great, fantastic. Okay, now approaching the conclusion of the interview, the place of skill-based training in the larger realm of the visual arts is a contentious issue. Many artists and scholars from outside the realist tradition do not see the value in it, and some even believe it can be damaging to one's personal creativity. This ultimately causes division between us and the contemporary art world. I would like to conclude the interview with this final quote, whereby you justify the relevance of technical training ever so eloquently. Quote, emphasis on seeing accurately is a necessary discipline of the student years. Apparently, people who are attracted to the realist tradition of art love the visual experience of real life and feel compelled to express themselves in those terms. That is, in the making of pictures based on the true representation of the way the world looks. The world, of course, has an infinite number of faces, but in order to represent any of them well, the student must first learn to see what is. And this is what the discipline of technical training is all about. End quote. Now, I'm certain that many artists who uphold the beliefs of our tradition will side with this passage, because this is essentially the whole point of the renewed interest in neo-academic art training. Similarly to the way we have the alphabet in the written language, which can be used to create words and then formulate words into sentences to create meaningful narratives, so too in representational art, which is a universal visual language, do we have line, shape, form, color, tone, composition, and perspective, which we study in isolation first and then together, in an attempt to master each one to ultimately equip ourselves with the skills necessary to make masterful artworks based on empiricism and rationalism. If the culture at large cannot see the relevance of such skill-based training, then I worry for the future of traditional realism. Peter, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, that quote that you quoted me on, that surprised me. I don't remember that one. As far as empiricism is um, is scientific inquiry, and it has a place in artistic inquiry and process, and the objectivity and so on of the classical approach. Just as intuition plays a part in scientific inquiry, but I think the two processes are divergent. I'm not sure I can explain it much beyond that. And reason, on the other hand, is increasingly rare in the world today. Frankly, I don't think the prospects look very good for it. It is, as far as some people are concerned, reason is a patriarchal social construct. And the irony is that when they cut themselves off from reason, or if we cut ourselves off from reason, then we have no other recourse than ignorance and violence. And they have to stamp their feet and shout their opponents down or shame them and turn their backs on those whose views they cannot tolerate, conveniently categorize all disagreement as hate and so on. And they generally plug their ears to and shut their eyes to what is true and beautiful. So I guess that sums up my thoughts on that issue.
Sure. And what are your thoughts on the whole idea concerning the fallout of technical skill in the realm of contemporary visual arts?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the technical skill can be used to represent anything, and it can be used to represent the trivial as well as the profound. On the whole, however, I think it's a good thing that people are acquiring an appreciation for skill, because it might lead them to reflect on the philosophical aspects of what they are doing.
Sure. Lovely. That's a lovely summation. I think you summed it up quite well there. Now, Peter, just before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to mention or perhaps revisit before we finish up with the interview?
No, I don't think so. I think I've probably done enough damage. So.
You don't have any exhibitions or anything planned for the coming years?
No, I don't.
Okay, great. Would you like to provide your contact information so that listeners can get in touch with you?
Well, I will say that people, if they want to contact me, can contact me through the comments section on my blog if they wish. And that is peterbougie.blogspot.com.
Great.
And if I could, I promise I won't publish any inquiries made solely for reasons of personal contact. And if they wanted a response to their inquiry, they should include an email address, and I would contact them that way.
Sure. And how about the address for your website?
Well, right now, I don't have that right in front of me. Right, I guess you could Google. If you go to my blog, there's a posting on there about the website somewhere in the last year. In one of the posts from the last year, there's a posting about the website with the URL there. But we're also in the process of creating a new website right now. Probably going to be up in the next month or so. So that'll have a new destination anyway.
Great, fantastic. Well, Peter, I would like to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. Hearing about your story and your life's work has been really fascinating. And I just wanted to say thank you as well for your efforts in maintaining the Bougie studio during the years that you maintained it, and for carrying the tradition as far as you have, and for continuing with your work and to uphold the legacy of Richard Lack, and to share your fine ideas on beauty and nobility and skill through your work. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you, Emilio, and thank you for your work as well. It's
great. Thank you very much.
A very large project.
Great, Peter. Thank you very much, and I hope to keep in contact with you and speak again sometime soon.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Okay, now. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.